So let's get to Korach, and I'll pull up the PowerPoints. And Korach, it means bald. However, that root word can also mean ice. It's interesting. It's Korach. And so we'll look at possibly, there might be more things to understand about Korach than just the fact that he was bald, which can, in some cases, be a symptom of leprosy. There's a healthy baldness, and then there's a leprosy baldness. And ironically, if you'll remember, when you're looking for tzarat, or leprosy, you're asked to look for a place where there might have been a burn, and the leprosy could have grown out of the burn, or something where there's been excessive heating and friction. Leprosy can grow there. But you can also have leprosy that grows out of a baldness, and with the baldness also having the implication of being ice or frost, then we can also see how leprosy might grow out of a coldness, out of a spiritual coldness and iciness. And I think we see that in the rebels in this week's portion, which I like the fire picture better than the ice. So here's just a summary of what's in the Torah portion. Of course, we've got the rebellion, and I think probably everybody who studies the Torah portions, when you say Korach, they already know it's about rebellion. Somehow we remember that part of Korach, the rebellion against the leadership. What is special about this particular rebellion is that it's a rebellion of leadership against leadership. And there might be a lesson there that we can learn. We also see that it's a continuation of Lashon Hara against the land of Israel. In the previous week's portion, which we didn't cover, Beshalach, we have the spies basically giving an evil report of the land of Israel. They're telling all the obstacles that they see in Israel. And here's the irony of that. 12 men saw the exact same thing. 10 of them saw impossibility, and 2 of them saw a promise. And so it seems to be that the minority is typically the one that there's a remnant. In most groups, there is a remnant. There's also a troublemaker in every group, but that tells us something, that we don't have to look at the numbers. We don't have to count heads to see if we're on the right track. Often the majority is the one that is on the wrong path. So in this week's Torah portion, the Lashon Hara against the land is continued. It's just picked up by a different group. We've got the fire and the fire pans. We've got the plague and the incense atonement. We've got Aaron's staff that comes to life and starts budding. We have a restatement of Levitical obligations. We have the inheritance of tithes, holies, and service, and then the Levitical tithe. And I think what we'll see is these last, well, really all of it works together, but I think we might see where the reiteration there of the tithes and the Levitical tithe actually ties right back into the rebellion of Korach and what might have motivated that rebellion. And in fact, you'll see a lot of discussions like this on Facebook. They're just, they've got a new frame on them, which is our own generation. But typically the argument is just the same. There's no person any better than I am. We're all holy, is what the rebel said. We're all the same. We're all equals. We're all part of the body. Why should I give a tithe to this other person? Why should I support this other person in their work? So as we see, the Torah portion really doesn't change. It's relevant in every generation. So we're going to go ahead and read the beginning here of the Torah portion in Numbers 16, 1 through 11, just to get the context. And let me move this where I can actually see it. Baruch hu et Adonai hamevorach, Baruch Adonai hamevorach le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher bechar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. Now Korach, the son of Ishar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliav, and On, the son of Pelet, sons of Reuven, took action. And they rose up before Moses, together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone far enough. For all of the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" When Moses heard this, he fell on his face, and he spoke to Korach and all his company, saying, "Tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and he will bring near to himself, even the one whom he will choose. He will bring near to himself. Do this. Take censers for yourselves, Korach and all your company, and put fire in them, and lay incense upon them in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the one who is holy. You have gone far enough, you sons of Levi." Then Moses said to Korach, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them? And that he has brought you near, Korach, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you. And are you seeking the priesthood also? Therefore, you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. But as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him?" Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu torat emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen. So we see here basically a rebellion, and the essential argument is we're all equals here. The whole congregation is holy. We were all betrothed. We were all married to Hashem at Mount Sinai. And Moses kind of takes this argument and flips it back on them, because he's saying, actually, your rebellion is not against us. And he says, as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him? So this idea of equalization, that we're all qualified, we're all called, we're all anointed, and no one is above another. And granted, the Torah is a great equalizer. However, the Torah does institute positions of authority and roles. Bonnie Manning wrote a really great blog this last week on the fivefold ministry and how you can see them in the 5 books of the Torah. And we can see these functions throughout the Torah, that people serve in different roles. Nevertheless, if we don't discern the authority and the position of someone, they were going to make some mistakes of arrogance. And so what we want to do now is just recognize this rebellion as not a new thing. It's just a continuation of the evil report against Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't fixed when it broke out the previous time. It was dealt with, it was punished, but it was not corrected. And when the problem actually resides within the generation, the problems will continue to arise. And we can see this phenomenon, I think, so easily in our own generation. We can see it if we watch politics, that even if you prove someone wrong, if you put the evidence in front of them, no matter how sound the argument and how thorough the evidence, they're going to persist in wrong thinking. And when they think wrong, they're going to argue wrong. So through habit, their thinking becomes twisted over time. And really, what is plainly evident is not what they're able to see. I think the modern term is they double down. If you confront them with an error, instead of admitting the error and correcting the error, instead they will double down and insist that it's not an error. And it is quite a phenomenon. And it's a little strange to watch because, you know, how do you look at evidence right in front of you and insist that it's not what it is? But we also know that Adonai can send strong delusion that people will believe lies. And it's not necessarily other people's lies they believe, it's their own lies. So we have in Israel a people who are saved, regardless, they're chained to old ways of thinking. And their thinking is so twisted that they've actually reversed the place of Israel and Egypt. And again, because the problem is present within the generation, the rebellions will continue. Because what they're being asked to change is what they see. Our challenge is to change what we see. Because if all we focus on is what we see in the natural realm, then we will eventually rebel. Because respecting what is holy requires spiritual vision, not physical vision. It requires faith, not logic. Logic is important. But when it comes to holy things, sometimes those things are illogical. Why would Aaron be any different than any other Israelite? Why would he be special? Why would the descendants of Aaron be special? Why would the Levites be special? Why would the descendants of the Levites be special? Well, qualitatively, they're probably not special. They're just other human beings. That's the natural argument. But what is the faith argument? That they are who they are by divine appointment. And we accept who they are by divine appointment, understanding that that does not diminish me in any way. So it's how you see things that matters. And let's look at Numbers 16, 12 through 14. It said, Moses sent a summons to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, we will not come up. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, but you would also lord it over us? Indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. So basically, Datan and Aviram receive a summons. And when you receive a court summons, you appear before the court. So just out of curiosity, when my husband came in today, he works at the courthouse, I asked him, how many people have a summons, they have a court date, but they never show? And he says, well, which court are you talking about? There's family court, there's district court, so forth. I said, just family court. He said, probably around 25% do not show up for their summons in family court. And so when you don't show up for your summons, then a warrant is sworn out and things get worse from there. But just imagine 25% of this particular county don't think it's important to respond to a court summons. 25% don't recognize the authority of the court. That's a pretty big number. Where did we get the idea that it's okay not to respond to a court summons? I'm not sure, but I think it's in this generation again, there's been a sharp decrease in respect for any authority. Instead of responding to an authority, to a summons or whatever, instead, everything becomes twisted and crooked. Well, why should I respond to a crooked system? Why should I respond to a defective system? Well, the answer is this Torah portion. Aaron was a defective human being. Moses was a defective human being. Nevertheless, by divine appointment, they had their positions in spite of their imperfections. So Moses sends a summons, and they do what 25% of the people in family court in Laurel County do. They said, we're not going to come. The system is broken. We're not coming. And so they flipped the script here. All of a sudden, Egypt now was the land flowing with milk and honey, and they just continued the bad report of Israel. And they say, no, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. You have not given us fields and vineyards. In other words, Adonai is not able to give us this land that he described to us. It's just not going to happen. So let's look for a chiasm. We're going to look at the previous passage, this one right here, and we're going to break it down into a chiasm. So before I do it for you, those of you who have worked with chiasms before, I want to give you just a few seconds here to scan through this passage. And I helped you out a little bit. I went ahead and bolded your bookends so you could find them easily. So just take a glance at it, and this is an easy one, and see if you can spot the chiasm, because if you can spot the chiasm, you can find the essence of their argument. You can find the axis of the problem. Okay, now, for those of you who don't know what a chiasm is, here's a blank template. And in a chiasm, what you have is a passage that is a mirror of itself. And so your first statement and your last statement will roughly match. And then the next statement and the next to last statement will roughly match. And you keep doing that until you find the axis or the central idea, the essence of the passage. So here's how it looks like. If we actually fill it in, your bookends that I highlighted for you, A was we will not come up. And then the bottom A is, would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. So you have matching statements. We will not come up. Your B statements. You have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness. Your mirror B statement is, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. What that leaves is the axis, the essence of the passage. And the question is, would you also lord it over us? In other words, do you want to be our master? Who do you think you are, Moses? You haven't delivered on anything you said. How can we respect you? You're sitting here day after day trying to teach us about something that we can't even do yet because we're not in the land and we're not going into the land because you're not going to take us into the land. You haven't delivered. Right? And at this point, they don't see all the obstacles that they have put in place so that they could not go into the land. They're not remembering the golden calf. They're not remembering the evil report. They're conveniently forgetting how they have tested Adonai instead of submitting to his tests to them. And really the question is, will they allow Adonai to be Lord over them? And Moses has told us, you're confusing human beings with Adonai. You're confusing the human beings he's appointed with him. But we're the ones you can get to. You're really angry with him. And so when you're asking, would you also lord it over us? Your accusation really isn't against Aaron. The accusation really isn't against Moses. It's against the Holy One. They don't want his lordship. So now let's look at some keywords that you'll remember. We've looked at words that hint to resurrection. And one of those is Allah, the root word Allah. And we've seen different forms of it like me'al, aliyah, ole, olah, different noun forms and verb forms that might come out of it. In this case, it's being used as a verb. So I have the same chiasm here, but I've filled in italics the Hebrew roots of the particular words. First, they say we will not come up. That's lo na'aleh, right? And that's going to be a future tense. We will not come up, future. We will not go up. And when we think of Allah in terms of the resurrection, the accusation, Moses, is that you will not be able to resurrect us. Instead, they say, you have brought us up, Allah, out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in this wilderness. In other words, what's the use in being saved? Well, we'll use that term. If you bring us up out of Egypt, you brought us up out of death. But you didn't complete the process. You were supposed to bring us out of death, but then deliver us into this Garden of Eden, this land flowing with milk and honey. So he says, you did bring us up in one sense, past tense, out of Egypt, out of a land flowing with milk and honey. But we're going to die right here. We're going to remain in the state of separation. And instead, you have not brought us into both a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields or vineyards. And so to close the book in, it says, would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. Lo na'aleh. So in our bookends, we have a twin accusation. In the future, we will not come up. Moses is not able to bring us in. Okay, if you come up from Egypt, when Egypt is Abaddon, Sheol, if you come up from Sheol, there's actually another step. At that point, you actually have to ascend into the lower garden. And the accusation from a prophetic standpoint is, somehow, Moses, you brought us up out of hell, but you've stopped short of the resurrection because we're dying here. We're continuing to die. So you're not able to do it. And again, they're not factoring their own behavior into the accusation. But at one level, some of the words they're speaking are true. It's just like the evil report. The words they were speaking were true, but what they saw was something completely different. At this point, things don't look how the Israelites expected. Their image of Israel was formed from their image of Egypt. If all you ever have is all you've ever seen, then how can you see what you have not seen when you can see only what you have seen? And I can't say that twice, so don't ask me to. What we know of the resurrection, what we know of life after death, what we know of the kingdom of heaven, we have the words, but the only image we have is this life that we live right now. And so when we're saved, or let's even take it a step farther, because they're talking to Moses. They're talking to the Torah. Moses is a metaphor of the Torah. We've discovered the Torah, and we were so overjoyed. I mean, how many of you thought that Yeshua was going to come at the next Feast of Trumpets once you figured out what the Feast of Trumpets was for? You were just convinced it was going to happen that year. And it didn't happen that year. So then you started reading all the books on the feast to figure out who was going to predict accurately when Yeshua would return on which feast, because then you knew it was going to come on a feast. And then it didn't happen. And it didn't happen. Year after year, it hasn't happened. So things don't look the way we expected they would look. The wonder of coming into the Torah, coming out of chains of old ways of thinking, and then all of a sudden seeing the Torah teaches us a new way of thinking, that wonder started to fade when we realized that things still don't look exactly what we expected them to look like in this place. Instead, we're seeing a lot of death and chaos. And that's the difficulty of faith. We have faith in the word, but even what we're walking in right now is being exercised from all our past experiences. It's still based on things we've personally seen and we've personally experienced. And so when we came into Torah, or when we came into salvation, we knew that Adonai was promising us something better than we had before. And then as we begin to walk in it, it turns out to be as much or more trouble than we ever had before. It's a different kind of trouble, but it's still trouble. It's still tribulation. And so when we start to experience these tribulations in this walk of salvation or in this walk of Torah, it really is hard to see the advantages of the destination. Israel becomes more of an ideal, like a fairy tale, than an actual place. Why? Because it's not what we expected. And what we expected really was based on our past experiences. As we walk, we're forming new experiences that are correcting our expectation of where we're going. But the rebels, they're really not confronting Moses with completely outright lies. They're simply not seeing what Moses sees. They're not seeing what Aaron sees. And so they ask, would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. And it's basically, you're trying to sell us some real estate, Moses. oceanfront property, but this is the wilderness. This is the desert. We're in a wilderness. There's no land flowing with milk and honey here. Where we came from has more milk and honey than where you brought us today. So how can you stand there day after day and tell us we're going to inherit fields and vineyards when all we see is this? Day after day after day after day. Nothing but sand, desert, dry places, wolves, hyenas, big lizards, snakes, scorpions. That's all we see. So if you got up out of your tent every morning and this is what you saw, do you have a little sympathy for where Korach and the rebels are coming from? Why, if your faith was shaky to begin with, why it would be easy to fall into this trap of looking at this endless sand and saying, this is not a land flowing with milk and honey. This is not fields and vineyards. There's nothing here but death. But see, when you look at that picture, you'll either see death and destruction or you'll see life. And that's why I love going to this place. This is the Tzin Desert where they wandered around. I love this place because it absolutely violates logic and reason. It's like the greatest opportunity to turn 360 degrees and realize that what your natural eye sees is not what is there. Something completely different is in that place. If I only had the right eyes to see it with. In fact, I think it's Ezekiel, where it talks about this place is going to be so full of streams and rivers and water that fishermen are going to stretch out their fish nets. And that's why I like walking up at the top of those mountains and finding sea snail shells, because I know it was that way before. Remember how it says Sodom and Gomorrah, it was like the Garden of Eden. And so this dry, arid place, once the prophecy is fulfilled, I want you to imagine that dry, desolate place you're looking at right now with water, with trees, with vineyards, with fields, with cows. It's hard to imagine because your eyes just don't see it. But your spiritual eyes can see it if you will allow them to. Moses and Aaron have the eyes to understand this desert for what it will be. The rebels, not so much. So they came up from Egypt, they came up from Abaddon, they came up from hell. They passed over the Yom Suf. So they've had a kind of immersion. And that's one type of resurrection. But what they're saying is we're unable to attain the land. We're unable to come in and cross the Yarden. See, they actually were in the land. When they were in this wilderness right here, they're, I believe, in the land assigned to Levi or Judah. Not Levi. That's not what I meant. Shimon. Shimon or Judah. It's a little fuzzy in that area, but most likely Shimon. So they're in the land. They're inside the tribal assignments. But what you have to do in order to come in the land is to cross the Yarden. It's a longer way. But think of what Moses has been teaching them. Once you come into that land, and I'm sure, again, they're thinking on a very physical, natural level. Once we get into the land, look at all these things we have to do. Look at all these festivals we have to walk to. Look at all the tithing we have to do. Look at all the second tithe and the third tithe and all the purity rules if we go up for the feasts, and this is the way we have to slaughter an animal. And it's they're thinking, my goodness, it's hard enough out here with just a tent in the wilderness. Imagine when he brings us in the land, how hard it's going to be to learn all this stuff. And you know what? You have heard that argument before. We've probably even used that argument ourselves before we found the wonder of the Torah. We couldn't imagine people who wanted to study this Torah and really keep it. Why in the world would you want to do all that? There's so many rules and regulations. It's so exacting. And once you cross into the land, there's a large number of commandments that are only active when you are in the land. So they're saying, okay, Moses, you've already burdened us with all these rules and regulations. How are you going to bring us into a land of inheritance? How are we going to cross that Yarden? We're not going to be able to keep all those rules once we cross over. And when we say we can't keep what's in the Torah, remember, Moses said it is not too high for you. That's significant. It is not too high. The lower garden is right above the land of Israel. And that is not too high. In fact, the rabbis say it's no higher than the height a dove would fly. So you get up on Mount Arbel or maybe Mount Hermon, and I don't know how you would measure physical distance because it's not a physical place. It's a spiritual place that's been separated from the physical, but will one day be joined again. So it's not that high. It's not unattainable. You can come in. There is another resurrection. And that other resurrection that they're talking about, because at this point they're in the wilderness, because of unbelief, they're dying. Moses hasn't stopped the dying. Well, the reason Moses can't stop the dying is because they couldn't stop the adultery when he went up the mountain to receive the rest of the Torah. Instead, they turned to a golden calf. They lost their vision. So he doesn't want them to come in to bow into the land, speaking of the lower garden, when they're still in a state of adultery. It's just like allowing them again. You give them the tree of life and let them stay in the garden, and then they'll introduce their sin and live there forever in sin. So there has to be, even at the physical level, there has to be a preparation period so that when they do come into the land, that they can persist there. Otherwise, that land will spit them out. And so in their minds, I'm sure they're thinking, my goodness, how can we ever resurrect if we've got to keep all these rules? But it's possible. So here's the Yarden. Here's the Jordan River. Beautiful, huh? It's more like a muddy, as they say in Kentucky, creek. But in Isaiah 53:2, it says, when we see him, speaking of Messiah, there is no beauty that we should desire him. So this is the place where its tradition says that Yeshua was immersed. And you can see John the Baptist, as wild as he was, choosing a place like this. He basically, what did he say, 8 locusts of wild honey? So I can see him picking the absolute muddiest spot in the Yarden so that if the hypocrites did come to visit, that they would get their dunking in a muddy place. That, again, it would be the great equalizer. But the idea here is when Messiah descended, we weren't supposed to look for somebody who was beautiful and handsome and desirable. Instead, it would be very human. he, to the natural eye, would be like this muddy Jordan. There's nothing there to desire but mud. It's just a shallow, hot little stream. So let's look at another example where the Jordan and its function was underestimated. It's 2 Kings 5, 9 through 14. It says, then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Yarden 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious, and he said, are not the Avanah and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Okay, but we'll stop right there before we go on. Look at some of the signs here of why leprosy might have broken out on Naaman. Pride. He's saying, he's so rooted in the natural realm, he thinks that this immersion is about beauty and physical attractiveness. He says, there's rivers in Damascus that are prettier than any body of water in Israel. Why can't I wash in them and be clean? And the other thing is that he was furious. Anger, again, can cause leprosy to break out. Why? Because anger is sometimes symptomatic of pride. You believe you deserve better than what you received. So he turned and went away in a rage. There again, he's upset. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? See, that's what he wanted. He wanted something commensurate with his position as the captain of the Aramean army. He wanted to do something magnificent. And they said, if he had told you to do that, you would have done it. But if all he's saying to you is wash and be clean, it says, so he went down. Basically, they're saying you got nothing to lose here. So he went down. You get that? He went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan. He was in a very high place in his own estimation. So he had to descend to the Jordan. And that's exactly what Yarden or Jordan means. Yarden means to descend. In order to understand the resurrection, in order to understand the Messiah, in order to understand Moses and the Torah, you have to go down. You have to decrease so that you can discern the increase. So he went down. He didn't go up. He went down before he went up. He dipped 7 times in the Yarden, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So the restoration there was of the flesh. And this possibly might be where there's a problem between the rebels, what they're saying, and what has already occurred. We know that they have been immersed in the Sea of Reeds. They came up from Egypt, they immersed, and now they're going up to Israel. But first, in order to cross at the proper place, and it's always at the same place, there's a crossing there near Jericho. That's where you have to cross over. In order to cross over and go up to Jerusalem, first you have to go down. So when Naaman went down, according to the man of God. Then his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. So in our process of resurrection, there's more than one step. First, there is a salvation from Sheol, from Abaddon, from Egypt. But guess what? We still have trouble in the flesh. At that point, the flesh is not like the flesh of a little child. We're still aging. I was saved when I was around 6 or 7. But guess what? I got lots of wrinkles. Guess what? I have to go to doctor's appointments. Guess what? I'm growing older. And unless Messiah returns, I will die. And there will be a waiting period until my flesh is restored like the flesh of a little child, until I'm actually clean of death. And that's the whole idea of ritual purity or being clean. It's not being physically clean. You see the problem here. He looks at this muddy river and he says, that's not going to make me clean. He misunderstood what clean was. Clean is not bodily clean, not a bad idea, but it's being obediently prepared. It's knowing how to manage your impurities in the flesh so that you are prepared to take on the flesh of a little child and be ritually clean so that you can live in those inner parts of the garden. So we've got salvation. We still have a period of trouble, of tribulation in the flesh. And that's what it says in Scripture, nevertheless, you shall have trouble in the flesh. But at the resurrection of the dead, your actual flesh, no matter what it looks like right now, your literal flesh will be restored like the flesh of a little child. And so the rebels are saying, okay, Moses, sure, you saved us from Egypt. Big deal. Because we're still dying in the wilderness. You've not restored our flesh. We're not going to go up. We're not going to go into the lower garden. There's not going to be a resurrection. And so they had a fundamental misunderstanding again of ritual purity and how part of ritual purity is acknowledging divine authority, acknowledging the role of the priest and the Levite in teaching you about ritual purity and preparation and being separate from death and things that are from the realm of death. So we have the Yarden, which means to come down. It descends. If we look at Yeshua as that glory of heaven, we realize that Yeshua says he put off the glory that he had with the Father in order to flow down from the throne through Israel. It's just like the Yarden River. Yeshua had no form or comeliness. It says that we should desire him. We look at the Yarden. It's just a muddy, small little river. It's not great. If you compare the Yarden to the great Euphrates or the Tigris, not that great, not that fantastic. However, that's exactly the prophecy, that what comes down to the throne has to be discerned with your spiritual eyes, not your natural eyes, because your natural eye will be attracted to the beauty of the Euphrates or the Tigris. But Yeshua descended with that song. He will descend with a shout, it says, and with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God. And when he descends, like the Yarden, then Israel can ascend in resurrection and have their flesh restored like that of a child's. So just a recap of Yarad, where we get Yarden. It's a river. It's the idea of coming down. crossing this river at a specific place in order to fully activate the covenant of the Torah, which they had to do when they crossed it. Why? Because they're pressing back into the tree of life and its blessings at the center of the garden. And so that covenant had to be renewed before they crossed back into the land. And remember, it was a covenant of Torah that Moses says, it's not too high for you. You're going to be able to attain the land through Yeshua. You're going to be able to attain it through this descending river of Eden. Why? Because Yeshua is going to come from the throne. He's coming from the throne above to the garden below. But you have to cross through Yeshua. You have to cross through the one who descends. And it's just like looking at that desert every morning. You're going to look around and it's just going to look like a bunch of sand. You look at this Yeshua, how many people use Christ or Jesus as a curse? They have no respect for the position that he occupies. They think he was just a man. And so what are they doing? They are failing to see with the spiritual eye who Yeshua is, where he came from, and where you have to cross in order to ascend to the garden. So there is that additional transformation once you're saved. There's something we call the resurrection. And in the Jewish tradition, when you enter the kingdom of this lower garden, you have to go in as a little child, just like we see in Naaman when he dips 7 times in the Yarden. His flesh is like a little child's. And that is a picture to us. When we dip in Yeshua, when we immerse in Yeshua, to the rest of the world, it may not be a desirable thing. It may, in fact, that Torah stuff looks pretty muddy to them because their vision is different. But if you will immerse in Yeshua, if you will immerse in this muddy river, then your vision can be restored. And then you will see what you cannot see. In Yeshua, you're going to have a resurrection that transforms. If you should die before Yeshua returns, you will only have a temporary body. It's called a garment while you await the resurrection. But at the resurrection, because Yeshua is the resurrection, he is going to be able to transform that temporary body into one of flesh, of childlike flesh. And we can see this in Mark 10:13. It says, and they were bringing children to him so that he might touch them. But the disciples rebuked them. When Yeshua saw this, he was indignant and said to them, permit the children to come to me. Do not hinder them. For the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it at all. He took them in his arms and began blessing them, laying his hands on them. And this is what we do on Shabbat. If you have children on Erev Shabbat before your meal, you call your children to you one by one, and you press both your hands upon their heads, and you speak blessings over them, and you pray for them. And that's a beautiful picture of being received into the kingdom at that ultimate rest in Messiah, where he can take us into his arms and begin to bless us and lay his hands on us. And at that moment, we become like little children with flesh like a little child. If you've ever just wished you could turn back time and be gathered into your father's or your mother's arms and feel their blessing, their hand on your head or hugging you close, then that's something to look forward to in the kingdom. that when you come into the kingdom, understand that Yeshua would be indignant with anyone who would not want him to greet you like a father greets a little child. And he wants us to receive that kingdom of God like a little child. Because if a father or a mother tells a little child that he or she will do something, they will believe it. And you have to lie to them pretty frequently for them to become disbelievers. But in their innocence, they just believe whatever mom or dad say. If they say, we're going to go get a piece of pie, then they believe we're going to go get a piece of pie. And that's the way we need to be with Yeshua. If he says that desert is a garden, no matter what our eyes see, we have to believe that desert is a garden. And he says in Matthew 18:3, he says, truly I say to you, unless you are converted, changed, and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. There has to be a transformation that takes place. And the transformation is in your vision. What do you see? A child doesn't see impossibilities the way that adults do. A child believes it's possible. I remember, I don't know how old I was, probably 4. And I ate this breakfast cereal called Quisp. And they had a little thing, if you had enough box tops from Quisp, if you sent them in with shipping money, then they would send you a little cap with a propeller on top so that you could fly like the little guy on the Quisp box. And when I was 4, I believed if I had that hat, that I could fly with that little propeller. I was converted. And I had to find out later that you cannot believe everything that you see on a cereal box, that you really cannot fly if you have the right hat with a propeller on it. But we have to believe in that same way. When you look at that desert, that it's actually the garden of the Lord. You have to be able to see it like a little child. The rebels are saying, we're not going to inherit milk, honey, fields, and vineyards. That's a very specific list. Jewish tradition tells us that the 4 rivers of Eden flow with milk, honey, wine, and balsam. So what are they saying? And I put a picture of the balsam. There's 2 pictures there. One is of the tree itself, which you can see it's not really a tree, it's a big bush. And then there's the little berry that grows on it. It's hard to see it on the big picture, but I did a close-up of one of the berries so you could see. But the actual resin comes out of the wood itself. It doesn't come out of that berry. You have to scratch into the wood and then catch the liquid as it bleeds out of the wood. And that balsam was actually much more valuable than frankincense and myrrh. It was the most valuable spice of ancient times. It was very fragrant. And so where do you grow balsam? You grow it in the field. So these rebels are saying, we're not going to inherit the lower garden. We're not going to be resurrected, Moses. Look around, dude. This ain't no garden. This is not a field. This is not a vineyard. Do you see palm trees? And because the honey, the dvash, it's understood that this is date honey, not bee honey. And so you have to have trees in order to have the honey. And so the balsam, again, it's a shrub of the field, and it's associated, again, with the kingdom. And this is from 1 Chronicles 14:15. There's some other passages that I didn't put in just for sake of time. but it shows you where the army of Adonai is. How high is the lower garden? Where are the armies of Israel? It says, it shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you shall go out to battle, for God will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. Okay, there's a balsam tree. How high is the army of heaven? How high is the lower garden? That tree you're looking at is about my height. I'm 5'5". It might be a little higher now than when I took that picture. How far is the kingdom? Is it too high for you? Or is it within striking distance? And those balsam trees, those trees of the field, they have a specific context, which is the garden of the bride. In Song of Songs 5:1, it says, I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh along with my balsam. So the bride comes into the garden and it is prepared with balsam and myrrh. And again, it's the balsam that is said to flow through one of the garden rivers. And when you mix myrrh with other scents, it smells wonderful. For instance, if you mix myrrh with balsam, it's a beautiful perfume. Now, alone, myrrh smells pretty skunky, right? But it's a burial spice. So there has to be a burial. That's where you get the myrrh. But if Yeshua takes the myrrh, which is a death spice, and we know that they were taking myrrh to anoint his body, what if he mixed the death spice with the balsam from the Garden of Eden? You would get a beautiful metaphor. This wonderful perfume of death actually mixed with a living tree. So what we think is death is actually a beautiful perfume of life, showing how that we will come into the garden as the bride, as the sister. But it depends on what we see. Do we see Yeshua, or do we see the Yarden as some puny, muddy stream? Or that is also the Garden of Eden. It's a matter of perspective. So do you want to see the muddy Yarden, or do you want to see this Yarden? Because this particular vantage point shows you its beauty. So sometimes when things look muddy, maybe we need to change our position, and we need to change our vision so that we can see it as it actually is. Something beautiful. So let's take that same concept, the same complaints of Korach and the rebels. You're just fallible humans, Moses and Aaron. There's nothing going out here but death. People keep dying in the wilderness. This is not what you promised us. So we have to say, what do we see? If we look at the physical land of Israel today, if we compare it to our own place, where we are right now, our own wilderness, does the land of Israel really look any better in the natural realm? Do we see giants that can't be overcome? Problems that are bigger than we are? Do we see war, immorality, crooked politicians, chaos in government? Well, that's pretty much a reflection of what we have in the United States. So at least we see a mirror image. If we look at Israel, we don't see any advantage. Why go to Israel when they have the same problems we do? We got Mickey D's, they got Mickey D's. See, we have this idea of what the land should be, a land flowing with milk and honey, some magical kingdom. We studied in Genesis 2 that the lower garden was a place of good gold. It had precious stones. And where's the good gold? We got golden arches and Mickey D's. It's not what we expected. So the temptation is to give an evil report of the physical land. But if we do that, it's because our vision has been clouded. Yes, the natural land has problems, but yes, the natural land has been and currently is experiencing miracles. And the miracle is that life is returning. Ultimately, and I got a hunch we're running out of time. Let me check. Yeah. Ultimately, what stopped? We had three problems here. Korach and the rebels, they were consumed. They were eaten alive by the pit. We had a plague. The people are still grumbling. They still don't see fields and vineyards, milk and honey. They still don't see Aaron as a leader until something happens. And then they accept Aaron. And that's the fact that his rod budded. They saw the living tree come forth out of a dead stick. When they saw life, they accepted his authority. When they saw his fruit, they accepted his authority. They accepted his anointing. When they see the almond buds, and remember it's almond blossoms that are on the menorah, when they see the anointing of the Holy Spirit, life finally convinces them. So it was a matter of vision. Korach, the rebels, all they saw was death. But Moses and Aaron were holding out for life in the land. And so when they say, would you put out the eyes of these men? It's another way of saying, Moses, don't tell us we're not seeing what we see. Look around. It's sand. It's desolation. There's no trees here. There are no wheat fields here. There's no place for cows to graze here. Where are the palm trees? Where's the honey? And so they're talking about physical vision. We see what we see. If we look at Israel today, we could say the same thing. We could pull up on any Israel news website. We could read those articles and we could say the exact same thing to one another. Would you put out our eyes and tell us there's not problems in Israel? Would you put out our eyes so that we can't see their problems are even greater than our own? When it comes to security, when it comes to politics, when it comes to social services. But see, we're reading things in the natural realm. We are not seeing what's hovering just above the land. If we are willing to descend in order to ascend, and Yeshua is the key. He's the crossing place for all of us. And once we've immersed 7 times in Yeshua, our vision should change. What we see in the land should absolutely change so that we're not bringing an evil report. Because Joshua and Caleb last week, they didn't deny that there were giants in the land. They didn't deny that the grapes were humongous. They didn't deny anything that they saw. They said, yes, it's there, but we can take it. We can do it. We are able. He didn't bring us this far to stop us short, but you have to see what they saw. You have to see the goodness and believe that it's not too high. It's not just a place for giants. You see, a giant, they're really tall. They can reach things we can't. But it's not too high for us. The land is not too high for us. And that's what we're doing right now. One step at a time, one line of Torah at a time, one prayer at a time, one volunteer trip at a time, one tour at a time. We're moving back. And he's going to bring us in. We have to believe he's going to bring us in. I don't know when. I don't know how. But I know he will, because I know it's home. It's home. So whatever we do, we cannot bring an evil report even of the physical land.